Well, thank you. Oops. I have to say I got it. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here. Thanks for being interested in this topic. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I have a whole curriculum for us to do, so let me get started. So as we said, I'll be talking about race, equity, and building conscious cooperative ecosystems. I do also want to start with a land acknowledgement to acknowledge the original stewards of the land wherever we are. I want to welcome our ancestors into this space, acknowledge any elders, and especially acknowledging the struggles of enslaved laborers, all those who labor without just compensation, those combating anti-Blackness. I want to acknowledge our claim to land and resources, right, in this settler colonial geography that we're in, acknowledge our history of resistance and our history of using mutual aid, solidarity, and economic cooperation for liberation. So welcome, everybody. I would like to get to know you all, so if you can give me your names and backgrounds, co-op affiliations, and if you have a favorite co-op diversity moment or a most memorable one, so maybe it wasn't a good one, but most memorable, and I guess I can start and then I'll call somebody on my screen and then you can call out the next person. So you already met me. The only other thing that I wanted to make sure you know about is that I'm a mother and a grandmother. I have 2 children and 4 grandchildren. So I'm also very proud of doing that and accomplishing all that I did while being a single parent. And it also, to me, helps me to remember that I'm doing this for the future generations, right? That we're doing this for the long run. My favorite co-op diversity moment, actually my most memorable one, is that when I first got excited about co-ops as a community development strategy in the 1990s, most co-op activities that I attended, most people I talked to about cooperative economics, no one could tell me about Black co-ops, especially not about any history of them, any tradition we had. Black folks actually told me Black people don't do co-ops. They were thinking mostly of what they were calling hippie food co-ops. Weren't connecting to any tradition of cooperative agriculture or credit unions or co-op, even any worker co-ops, anything like that. And then of course the white folks knew almost nothing, didn't know, kept talking about history as being a co-op European history and not having anything to do with African peoples. So that was what was most memorable to me. And that's actually why I wrote the book on the history of African American cooperatives, because it's never made sense to me, and I figured somebody needed to uncover and to rediscover the stuff that must have been going on. And I was lucky to find that there was enough to write a book. Probably I should have written 2 books, but anyway, enough to write a book and that kind of thing. Rodney, how about you? You want to introduce yourself?
No, I was going to end up being first. Rodney Jordan. I'm in Norfolk, Virginia. I'm a proud father of 2 adult daughters, and I think I'm almost 9 months into being a grandfather. So I am enjoying that. I don't have a specific, well, I don't have a specific co-op affiliation. What I do have, Jamie and Levette, who are also on the call, the 3 of us have founded a for-profit neighborhood enterprise that we are looking to integrate cooperative or co-op principles into that. Our goal is to basically buy up the neighborhood and provide ownership shares for historic stakeholders in the neighborhood if they'd be so interested and willing to invest and cooperate. Something that you said that resonates with me. So in the mid to late 90s, I have an older brother. We started a internet company back in 93, 94, originally called New Perspective Technologies. We launched one of the first African-American web presences on the internet back in 94 called Melanet. And then in the mid 90s, we met an investment banker, one of the first women investment brokers on Wall Street, white Republican, worked at HUD in the Jack Kemp administration. But she was raised in Pennsylvania by a Black woman. And we met and has spent probably the last 20, 30 years trying to figure out how to unleash the economic assets in what we call high yield neighborhoods that others may call low income neighborhoods. And so we created something called a Neighborhood Equity and Trust Corporation, which is also has some of the principles that Jamie and Levette and I are discussing. So I still have that dream of one day having net cores, as we call them, in neighborhoods throughout the country that use technology to basically advance cooperative ownership in neighborhood enterprises. So that's my co-op diversity moment and a little of my background.
Thank you so much. Pass it on.
How about Wendell?
All right. Wendell Holmes is my name. And I'm a proud father of 5. And 5 children and 8 grandchildren. 2 of them are in college. All of them are very creative and artistic after me and their mom. You know, so we have everything from visual arts to performing arts to even film and production. And so my work is in Baltimore, Maryland, and I'm associated with, through my church, a mission that seeks to support citizens who are returning back to the community from incarceration. And that community in particular is Sandtown Winchester of Baltimore. It's the Freddie Gray neighborhood, one of the more depressed neighborhoods in the city. And so me and Antoine and another team member, and along with our board, we created a nonprofit called Charles Johnson Park Development Corporation. And the idea is to develop a 3 square block area which contains vacant lots, and develop those parks and also the real estate around those parks, and hopefully create a model that can be expanded throughout the city. And so the idea of co-op seemed so logical and to fit perfectly with creating support and particularly jobs and training for men and women coming back to the community from incarceration. So landscaping company, a barber shop, a cafe, catering business, but also services, which Antoine is more adept and has knowledge of services that actually serve that population. And so I'm going to stop right there.
Thank you. Sounds great. Pass it on.
Antoine.
I knew you was going to choose me. Okay. I'm Antoine Bennett. I am affiliated with, as you just heard, the Charles Johnson Park Development Corporation, along being a principal founder, along with Elder Wendell Holmes, and I pretty much shared a lot of the background that you just heard from Elder Holmes as it relates to our church, our focus, and our goals and objectives. I'm from Sandtown, born and raised. I just want to mention I agree with everything Elder Holmes said, and we're one of the largest communities in West Baltimore as it relates to Sandtown. And I certainly agree with him when he says we're one of the more depressed communities found in Baltimore City in the state of Maryland. I know that firsthand. I'm multi-generation, Santonian, and I just made that word up. I never heard anybody use Santonian before. And so, my favorite co-op, diversity, even though we're fresh from scratch, would be the Charles Johnson Park and its goals and objectives. I think it's so genuine, and I think it's so timely as it relates to the needs, the felt needs of the community of Sandtown. Also, I want to mention that Sandtown is the community that boasts or hold the most ex-offenders returning from the state penitentiary to a single community. And so we're very timely as it relates to our goals and objectives through the Charles Johnson Park Development Corporation. And I'm gonna stop there. And I'll pass it on to Chago. I think, am I pronouncing it right, Chago?
Hello, everyone. My name is Chigo. My pronouns are she, her.
Sorry.
Yeah. I was born and raised in New Jersey. I live in Baltimore. Right now, I'm in South Africa, and I excuse you for cutting in and out. I'm here with Onyinye, and we plan on starting a rice farming cooperative. I think my favorite part about cooperative development is that there's a shared profit system. There's shared learning. It's an opportunity for members to get acclimated with the ins and outs of business and financial endeavors. And we're both very excited to bring this to Nigeria. We don't know of many cooperative developments or the history of cooperatives in Nigeria. And we are excited to do that. So I'm going to pass this to Onyinye. Okay, you're good.
No, it's okay. Can you hear me now? Okay. Sorry, y'all. Hi, I'm Onyinye. I'm with Chigo. We're actually in the same car right now. We're both in Johannesburg, South Africa. I'm currently living in Mozambique, but grew up in West Baltimore in Upton. And as Chigo mentioned, we're studying a cooperative rice farm in Nigeria. My favorite co-op diversity memory is when I was living in Ecuador. I got the chance to go to an indigenous seed library, which was part of an agricultural cooperative. And it was really cool to learn about their practices and some of what they're growing. So I will pass it to Jamie.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jamie Pickens. I'm partner with Lavette and Rodney in our real estate investment co-op. My professional background is in property management. I am a licensed real estate agent, and I am a real estate investor. My co-op memory, I would say, is the first time I ever really began to think consciously about co-ops. I was actually traveling in Morocco and had the opportunity to visit a argan oil co-op that was owned by women in that community in Morocco. And it was a way for women to make money to be able to take care of their families. And so they harvested argan oil from the nuts, and they create products, hair products, skin products, and we were able to purchase some on site. And they just showed us the entire operation and talked about, you know, how it impacted their community. And that's really the first time that I consciously thought about co-ops as a whole and their purpose and what they do and their usefulness. So I'm happy to be here. And I will pass it to my partner, Lavette.
Hello again, everyone. My name is Lavette Bell. I am originally from Albany, New York, but Norfolk is my home now. I am a licensed real estate agent. I've been an agent for going on 9 years now. I absolutely love what I do. I really do. As far as, I'm in partnership with Jamie Rodney, as they already said. They are my neighbors as well as my friends. And I feel like they're becoming family. So as far as the co-op thing, I've actually heard the word co-op over the years, but I never really thought much about it. So when Rodney bring it to our attention, you know, we all were really excited about it. I know I was, as far as getting the education and learning more about it. So we kind of, you know, signed up for this, and we're learning, and we hope to take this education to just kind of use it for whatever future endeavors we, you know, it may kind of fit in with. So I'm looking forward to the rest of this. I think we end on what, December 3rd. So we still have a ways to go. We've learned a lot so far. And again, it's every week, you know, I learn more and more about it. So let me see, I can't see everyone. So
I think we might be finished, right?
I'm the last one. Okay.
Did we miss anybody? No, right?
That's
Okay.
it. Okay.
Great. So these projects sound fantastic. So I'm very excited. I'm glad you're going through this program, and that you guys have all these wonderful plans. I'm excited to hear more about them. So what I'm going to try to cover today, and we may not need the whole 3 hours, but I did try to kind of give us enough time to break up in small groups if we want to keep processing this stuff. So talking about diversity, inclusion, equity, and justice in the co-op movement, understanding racism, exploitation, structural and institutional racism, recognizing white privilege and microaggressions, especially in, you know, the co-op so-called progressive movements, talking about the challenges to diversity, which I guess is why you guys are mostly here, and some solutions like proactive anti-racism, and having to, you know, how to use diversity, inclusion, equity, and justice. And then I want to go back into history for us to talk about African American co-ops, to see how some of them address these issues, especially issues of making sure that Black communities had access to co-ops. And I'll give you some examples of different organizations and co-ops that made that happen. We'll talk about sabotage against Black co-ops, and again, kind of try to end on solutions and lessons learned. And then we'll talk about whether you all want to come up with some kind of action plan for your group on how to move forward on some of these issues. So we'll end with, trying to figure out sort of what are the lessons learned about ecosystems, and if you want to create action plans, we can do that. So any questions about that? Also, anything I missed that you were hoping or expecting that I would cover, I'll give a note and I probably can make sure to cover it. And any initial questions about any of these topics? That means everybody's good. Okay. Great. I'm sure you'll figure out something that I've missed as we go along. But as I said, or maybe I didn't say it, I plan for this not to really be a lecture, more of a seminar. So, jump in anytime with a question, comment, anything like that. I will sort of lecture with some stuff I'm trying to get across, but also if you guys feel like you know it already or we don't need to go over it in as much detail, you can stop me and ask me to move on or anything like that. I don't take offense. I really want this to be useful to all of you. So I kind of guessed at what might be helpful given our topic, but so any feedback while we're going along, if I have too much on one topic and we've covered it enough, just let me know, say, Jessica, can we move on? So the first thing, I think you all know this already, but I find it important to say because, as I said, when I first started out in the co-op movement, everybody thought, co-op started in 1844 with the Rochdale pioneers and that the Europeans do cooperation and the Europeans brought it to the US and it's a very white thing and whatever, but actually when you start to study mutual aid, solidarity, economic cooperation, it's been utilized by every population and every era of human history on every continent, right? Cooperation and economic cooperation was actually our first economic system. It's our most long-lasting system. We don't think of it that way because racial capitalism is so all-consuming. But really, human beings, right? We've survived because we've cooperated, right? If you think about the hunter-gathering, right? The first agriculture, right? That was all about people doing things together. We know that all indigenous groups, especially early African civilizations, the First Nations here in the Americas, right? All started out doing cooperative efforts. They weren't the official, incorporated co-ops that we have now, that we have since the late 1800s. But they were all different kinds of levels of solidarity, collective work and responsibility, sharing the commons, economics for the common good, right? Not hoarding, right? There was even, the notions of ecology and connection to the earth and, making sure everything was going to exist for 7 generations, all those kinds of notions that were in this together, that were in this for the common good, that were all working together, sharing and caring. And so there are long histories for any of our populations of informal and formal collectivism, mutual aid, including revolving loan funds types of things, as well as I said, collective agriculture and that kind of thing. So I do like to start out because, again, as I said early on, luckily it's not so big a problem now, but early on, a lot of Black folks just felt like it wasn't our tradition. It wasn't part of our tradition. And we've been encouraged, I think, by outside forces not to connect to this area. So we do live in racial capitalism, which has kind of consumed things, so that makes us feel like co-ops are an alternative and, not even necessarily very viable, right? So it's important to understand that context also because of racial capitalism and its control over our whole political economy, right? It's also often been dangerous to talk about alternatives and to talk about co-ops and collectivism and solidarity economics because it undermines capitalism and it undermines capitalist profit making, right? So often, again, a lot of the stuff that we did do was done underground, was done very quietly. We didn't name it a co-op, etc., because we were protecting ourselves and protecting the co-op from the capitalist forces that were going to try to overwhelm it, undermine it, sabotage it. So we know, right, that racial and gendered capitalism, which is capitalism, right? Capitalism doesn't exist without racism and without gender inequality, right? It's all about maximizing profit at the expense of labor, people, and the earth, right? And it especially disproportionately exploits people of color, women, and LGBTQIA plus people. And so again, economic cooperation, solidarity economics has, in the last 400 to 500 years has been in reaction to racial capitalism and as a way to protect ourselves from that.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Is there a kind of a prevailing a notion that co-ops do they kind of brand them with the kind of boogeyman term of communism or socialism?
So it's getting better. But definitely in the 50s and 60s and 70s, there was that branding, right? The groups that did try to engage, especially the Black groups that tried to engage in cooperativism and co-ops, were often targeted. You know, we know about the Black Panther Party. Most people don't realize they were also trying to do co-ops and collective economics and stuff. You know, they were clearly terrorized and branded. The Federation of Southern Cooperatives, which is our only Black regional, or was our only Black regional co-op development group. They were targeted by the FBI several different times. And some of the groups within the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, their co-ops were targeted. We know there's actually a really interesting statement that Andrew Young made. He actually got one of the awards from the Federation of Southern Cooperatives for supporting co-op development. And he said in his in one of his talks when he was receiving that award that, you know, in the 60s, they were doing cooperative economics, but not talking about it for two reasons. One, because it was so dangerous, because they would be tainted with communism, and they didn't need that. They were trying to get the voting rights stuff and the other legal rights. And so they downplayed co-ops and economic justice issues. But he also said the second issue was they didn't feel like the Black community was unified around co-ops enough. And they didn't want there to be too much dissension about the strategy, right? So they focused on the things that people agreed with, like voting rights and that kind of thing. So it's really interesting when you put all that together. I have argued that part of the reason why Black folks don't utilize or know that much about co-ops as an economic model is because of the red baiting and things like that, in addition to just the all-consuming hegemony of capitalist ideology and capitalist feelings. So we really have to be retaught or untaught. I've also been known to rail against kindergarten and formal education because I think by the end of kindergarten, they've pretty much beaten out of children all our cooperative tendencies, right? I mean, the only thing, right, in kindergarten, you're supposed to cooperate when you play, but when you do the hard stuff, when you're learning, right, you're not supposed to, right? And in fact, it's cheating if you cooperate or collaborate with other people, and you really don't graduate from kindergarten, right? If you don't learn that you're supposed to stay in your lane, regurgitate what the teacher says, don't talk to other kids, don't collaborate with anybody, right? You fail kindergarten if you don't learn that. And so then we wonder why it's so hard later in life for us to go back and teach people that it's okay and it's actually good to cooperate. So we need, so I'm sorry for me to get off on the tangent, but good question. But right, so we need to, and then, for groups like yours, we need to spend a lot of attention deliberately teaching ourselves how to work together, how to make decisions together, how to address conflict. Right? Those kind of things are the things that are going to ruin a co-op if we don't figure it out early on and don't keep training ourselves and learning together, because the whole rest of society is teaching us something different and rewarding us for something different, right? So we really have to change that mindset. Yeah, did you want to follow up? Go ahead.
No, this is Rodney. I was going to, and I don't.
Jamie had her hand up too.
Oh,
go ahead, Rodney.
Okay. Well, I'll let Jamie go first then, since she hit her hand.
Okay, so transparency. There's probably more I don't know about co-ops than there is that I do. I'm still really, really learning. And so one of the things that I think about with our group, our project, our community is how do you include the people who need it the most and have the least resources to become investors in something? How do we sell this to the community? How do we include those that need it the most so it doesn't look like well, it's just the people who probably invest anyway that are going to be able to invest in this. You know what I'm saying? So like,
Yeah.
how do we sell it? How do we make the community excited about it? And how do we include everybody?
Right. That's a fantastic question. So what I've seen through history and what I've been learning as I've been studying this is there's a couple of things. First of all, the storytelling, right? Telling of how other groups did it and the successes as well as the challenges. So the story, the storytelling, reminding people, right? Because, right, we live in such a hierarchical, exploitative world, we forget that we actually do all practice some aspects of solidarity and collectivism already in our lives, right? We barter, right? I babysit for you, you bring me dinner, or you take me to my doctor's appointment, and I pick up your kids after school, right? So we all already share things and share economics in some way. So I try to also make sure to remind people of that, right? So that's sort of how you get into it, how you get people interested in it. They can see how people who are in similar situations to them use cooperatives and solidarity and made things better, reminding people that we all do it, that it's, that it's natural to us. What this other stuff is what's unnatural, but we're so normalized in our society that we think the unnatural stuff is natural, right? So I try to have those conversations. And then in terms of the actual mechanics of it, that's where the study groups, the learning together, and the sweat equity come in, right? People, we don't have to, right? We because again of capitalism, right? We see resources as financial resources, right? You've got to have that $100, that $500 to join or to be, right, or to really, right? But there's other ways, there's other kinds of resources that we can recognize, and a lot of the Black co-ops through history have used installments, right? Okay, so you don't have the $100, but you have $5 today. So you can pay $5 the first day. You can do sweat equity and come and help us paint or do this, do that, or you can fundraise, right? We have a lot of co-ops that also ended up doing all kinds of like, fundraising things like the rent parties, but doing it for co-ops, right? So having, having parties and other kind of things where the money that you make from it goes either to your payment for the co-op or goes into the co-op coffers. So thinking about all those kind of non-traditional kind of ways that we've raised money for other things, right? Even the whole mutual aid model where everybody puts in a little bit each month, or, using an Isusu, so that the month that you get your payment back from the Isusu is the month that you pay into the co-op, right? So connecting us to the ways that we've always kind of made it work and recognizing that all those different ways are just as valid, right? And so not even stigmatizing, right? Maybe everybody pays in installments, even though we know some people don't need to, right? So it's not stigmatized. It's seen as a regular part of the whole process, and it connects with what we already usually do for other stuff, right? But now we're doing it for the co-op or to make money for the co-op or to keep the co-op going. I know of co-ops also that actually record how much time people put in, even for meetings. Some co-ops are able to pay people for the meeting attendance, especially worker co-ops, if they've been able to raise some startup money. They can pay you for your time, right? So just thinking about all the different, right, what are the barriers, and then all the different ways that we can collectively in solidarity or whatever, think of the solutions. The other example I want to give you, there is a co-op in Atlanta, or there was, I guess it's still going, from the mid 2000s. They were actually a home buying co-op. And basically they were a kind of co-op Isusu, because what they did was everybody put in, I think it was 500, it was a lot of money, 500 or 1,000 a month, so that within 6 to 8 months, one family would always have enough money for a down payment for a house. And so there was this commitment to stick to the co-op until everybody in the co-op had the down, were able to have the down payment based on everybody's submissions. But in the middle of it, right, one couple both lost their jobs, couldn't come up with the monthly money, and came to the meeting and said, you know, we've got to drop out. We're really sorry. We don't know what to do. And the rest of the members said, no, 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 don't. Let's try some other things. And they ended up listing what the couple's skills were and everything, and recommending them to their friends and referring them to other things. And they were able to piece together consulting and stuff like that so that they could make some money and could still contribute their share to the co-op so they could continue their membership. So that's what I mean by, you know, thinking in a solidarity way, but in ways of how else, what else, if it wasn't the co-op, how would we help someone to do this? And then we can also apply that to the co-op. So hopefully that helps to give you some
Yes.
ideas. Obviously, there's a lot more ideas, but that kind of way of thinking. But again, when everybody's studying and working together, it's not a stigma, right? It's not about a stigma. It's about we're all in this together, and there's ways that that are helping each other is going to help us also to do this co-op.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a different way of thinking from what we've been conditioned towards. So that'll be the thing right there to get everybody to think differently.
Absolutely. And you know, it's funny, for a while I was studying micro lending because I was trying to figure out why it was so popular. And of course, part of why it's popular is because it's small amounts that people can handle, right? But the other thing I noticed, all of those micro lending programs still had this solidarity element. In fact, a lot of them had this requirement that there be a cohort of people who got these small loans, and the whole cohort had to make sure that each other paid off the loans and helped each other. Well, that's really that's back to a co-op model, except that it was actually extractive, like micro lending, right? Even though it was small amounts, they were still paying interest on it and whatever, whereas the co-op model would be less extractive. But that notion that everybody had to help each other and that people were willing to do that, even for those small amounts in micro lending, reminded me that, right, that it's really back to a co-op model. And that's why micro lending was working, because it was a solidarity co-op model, not because it was, not because the capitalist ideology so much. So anyway, Rodney, you were the one who was talking next, right?
Yeah, you've taken me back to a whole lot of things. So you just reminded me, I don't know if it was Black Enterprise or some magazine 30 years ago had it 20, 30 years ago was featuring Susus, and I kept it. Now I'm going to have to go back through my filing cabinet and see if I still have it. But I was going to, and I guess first touching on Jamie's question, my hope is that, now that the crowdfunding and crowdsourcing technology is what it is, that you no longer need to be a sophisticated investor to do $5, $10, $100 into an entity. So I hope that's something that we'll be able to realize. But as you were talking about capitalism, so I want to ask you about your participation on the Howard University's I'll call it Black Wealth Initiative. But I also want to ask you about Marcus Garvey and UNIA. So it just so happens that in Norfolk, where Jamie and Levette and I are, I know my grandparents on my father's side were UNIA members, and Norfolk was, I think, had the third largest chapters of Marcus Garvey's UNIA movement behind New York and New Orleans. So that principle that Marcus Garvey had of the Black Star Line and buying shares and owning and having farms and manufacturing and producing. So I kind of consider myself a Marcus Garvey two-test capitalist, in that create wealth but do no harm. So I just want to put that out and get your feedback, because as you were talking about capitalism, at the same time, part of our strategy is to create wealth and ownership, even though it's within that framework.
Right. So I could talk for hours about all that. Let me see how to contain it here. First of all, at the Howard project, I actually was the one doing community wealth building stuff. So I was working, doing reports for them. Well, first I was doing reports for them on heirs property and Black land loss and subprime lending, but then I quickly moved into doing co-op study, studying, helping groups that wanted to do co-ops in the South to understand the benefits and the impacts of co-ops and the wealth benefits of co-ops. So even though wealth sounds like it's feeding into capitalism, it doesn't have to. Right. And so a lot of the work I was doing was showing, one, how co-ops and credit unions, which are financial co-ops, help individuals and families gain assets and save and all that kind of stuff and get access to capital and access to mortgages, which gives them access to real estate, that kind of thing. But I was also studying what I called community wealth. Right. And how do we think about, right, if, and I do believe that capitalism is a horrible system, right? So I'm not really a supporter of Black capitalism, though I think it could be a stage as we move towards something else. I do believe that we should all have wealth and have assets, but I also believe that we can be wealthy by sharing assets. Right. So community land trust, housing co-ops, credit unions, et cetera. We don't have to own everything ourselves if our collective ownership and joint ownership of things make sure that that we're not poor, that we have a roof over our head, that we can feed our children, that kind of thing. And I do find that when you look at the benefits of co-ops, it does have that shared profit, right? So co-ops, it's not that they don't make a profit. They try not to call it a profit. They usually call it surplus. So it's not that they're not making surplus, it's what they're doing with it, right? No one's hoarding it, right? Their purpose is not to just make surplus, right? Their purpose is to create a good or service that's accessible to people that people need. And in the process, they need the surplus so that they can keep doing what they do and so people can prosper, right? And then the other point of a co-op is that people jointly decide what to do with that surplus, with that profit. And so that's the other piece, right? Again, it's not about hoarding. It's about making sure that everybody gets access to the surplus, gets to share it, gets to decide what happens to it, and gets to use it for what they need or leverage it. Because that's the other thing I talk about for when I talk about community wealth and community assets. They often mean that you can leverage something that's jointly owned without owning it yourself, but leverage it in order to make sure you personally and your family can get what you need and that the co-op can keep thriving. And so that's how I kind of like to talk about it. And, I also believe if we have a system of interlocking, an ecosystem of interlocking co-ops, then all the different co-op ownerships that we could be in would give us all the things we need that we normally think we need from wealth, right? So again, for housing is in a housing co-op, and housing co-ops, of course, you still actually own your own unit, but the co-op owns the property and helps to make it viable for you to own it, right? Then you've got your money in a credit union and access to capital in a credit union. You're in a worker co-op, which pays you well, but also because you're a part owner, you get to share the profits of that business. You could be in a co-op grocery store and have food access, you know what I'm saying? So if you put all those things together, then what do we need? I mean, it would be nice to have millions, but it's nice to have millions because we're in such a capitalist society, right? But if all of our needs were met through the co-op, I even know some worker co-ops that own vacation homes, and then every worker gets to have a weekend or a week, they can sign up for a week to use the vacation home. So we wouldn't even need a vacation home if we had a good viable worker co-op that owned a couple of them and we all got access to it, right? Because we don't go on vacation every week, right? So why do we need our own vacation home? And so it's that kind of thinking. Again, it might not work for everybody and it might not work in the short run, but for the long-term vision, right? That's my notion of community wealth, collective wealth. And so, as I said, I think there are going to be steps along the way, and we may still have to participate in capitalism on the way to this vision. But if we understand that it's a stepping stone, not the end result, right? I think we'll be better off as a society. I can't remember if I touched on all the things you asked about. But that's the short answer. As I said, I could go into this for hours.
You did fine. I'm sure it'll come up again.
So I'm gonna keep going. So you get the message about, you know, constructs of inequality and hierarchy and the way that capitalism traumatizes us, right? And so we're trying to use these economic systems like cooperatives and solidarity to undo, right? To undo those oppressions and inequalities and to reproduce them in new ways, not reproduce them, sorry, to produce new ways to go about this. And also we need to understand the intersectional, right, oppressions, race, gender, sexual orientation, class, able-bodiedness, right? They're all going to come into play, even as we're trying to create these new systems, right, and new paradigms. We've got to understand the ways that we all have intersectional oppressions and the people that we work with and in co-ops with, right? And so that means we've got to recognize multiple overlapping identities and the effects of overlapping oppressions, reject an either or binary thinking about how to deal with them, and accept a both and framework. Do I need to say anything more about that, or that's clear enough? We're good. And then I think I don't need to go into this, but economics is violence, right? But it also engenders resistance. We do create caring communities. We do share risks and profits in our worker co-ops, housing co-ops, food co-ops, credit unions, and other collectives, right? And so again, we know that we're not stuck with the exploitative model that we're in. I also have been doing a lot of talking lately about that co-ops can be racist, right? But most people think co-ops can't be racist or gender biased or heteropatriarchal or ableist. But we know that co-ops actually do reproduce societal norms. And so since we live in a racist, heteropatriarchal, ableist society, our co-ops can be that way. And as I said, a lot of the history that I did, Black folks decided to do their own co-ops because they couldn't see themselves or couldn't join the predominantly white co-ops. So there's still, even in this glorious history of what we were able to succeed at, it sometimes was, we had to do it on our own terms by ourselves, especially because we're in such a racist society. We had to create our own power, stability, and economic power before we could even think about integrating. So there's, again, even if we want to integrate, right, we can't integrate until we gain our own, right, have our own power, do what we need to do to have our own self-determination first, and then integrate from a position of power rather than from a position of inferiority and exploitation. So what that means is that diversity and inclusion are not enough, right? We can't just be diverse. We can't just include a bunch of people. We have to look at the power dynamics and understand the roles of equity and justice if we really, right, for our final goals. So, oh, can't even read that. How do we how do we know? What are the ways that our co-ops perpetuate institutional racism, engage in racist microaggressions and exclusion? In a minute, I'm actually going to see if you guys want to go into small groups, or else we can just have a more discussion about it. But the ways that I found in my research and as I joined the co-op movement was the missing in action. I said that to you already, right? When I first got involved, there was almost no Black people at the meetings, no Black people in co-ops that I saw, no Black co-ops that were highlighted. You know, every now and then, if a meeting was in the South, I would run into people from the Federation of Southern Cooperatives who were mostly doing co-op agriculture, Black co-op agriculture, but they didn't tend to come to the meetings that were outside of their region. And the white folks didn't even really talk about them until I would start asking questions, and then they would bring them up as sort of the token group. So that's what I mean by missing in action, right? We just don't see, people didn't include Black co-op folk and Black co-ops, and people didn't know so much about what was happening in the Black community. The next problem is, right, invisible white privilege, right? Even if we're all Black co-ops, we suffer from white privilege in terms of that our co-ops are either targeted more for ideological reasons or for economic reasons. And so we're still more vulnerable. It's harder for Black folks to start and to maintain co-ops, even though co-ops in general have better longevity and survive longer than regular small businesses. And I think I have I get into that later when I talk about the benefits of co-ops. So even though co-ops have all these general benefits and are generally a stronger economic development model, right? Because of white privilege and the microaggressions that happen inside and outside of our co-ops, right? We're more vulnerable. We have more problems starting. We have more problems getting people to understand co-op economics, all that kind of stuff. The third thing is when you do have some integration in co-ops, there's lots of individualism and tokenism, right? A lot of times when I was at the meeting, people were like, well, you're here, right? So we're clearly not all white, right? But just me being there is not good enough, right? Just having one Black person doesn't mean that you're really integrated or that you really even have diversity, right? Or having me as a spokesperson. You know, you can't tell you how many meetings I've been at where I was the one who was supposed to talk for all Black co-ops. That's ridiculous. But again, those are the kinds of things. And then the biased materials, and we still don't have good, though I think we have better materials and that's being fixed. But so many of the materials, as I said, all started with cooperation, started in 1844 with the Rochdale Pioneers. They featured all white co-op leaders, white co-ops, white co-op issues. And so even when I was starting to get Black groups interested in co-ops, there weren't any materials that they could connect with. So those to me are the ways that racism, racist microaggressions, exclusion, right, have been perpetuated in the co-op movement, even though, as we said, most people in co-ops think of themselves as very progressive, right? The principles of co-ops are about open membership and all that kind of stuff. But there are these problems. So do you want to divide up into groups, or I guess we're a small enough group? People just want to talk about, right? How do we recognize the ways that our co-ops perpetuate or engage in racial microaggressions? And remember, even if we're all Black co-ops, we can treat each other, right? With racial microaggressions or ethnic microaggressions and not realize it. I think in a minute, I also have some more definitions of what I mean. So let me know if you want me to go through the definitions first and then we should talk about it, or if we're ready to talk about it.
Can you go through the definitions first?
Okay, let's see. Hopefully I have them next. Oh, and I don't know. Do I need to go through? I had structural institutional racism and then the microaggressions. Do you want me to go through that, right? The norms we live with, the invisible racism, right? I'll just go through it quickly, right? We know that race and gender are actually what we call socially constructed, meaning there's no biological basis for them. They're really about, right? So if you take Manning Marable's definition of race, it's an unequal relationship between social groups based on the privileged access to power and resources by one group over another. And of course, anti-Black racism is whites' privileged access to power and resources over Blacks. Historically and socially constructed, created and recreated by how people are perceived and treated in the normal actions of everyday life. So this definition of race is nothing to do with genetics or biology, right? That's what we mean by the social construction. It's not a genetic or a biological, right? Actually, we know now that human beings are too new a species to even have subspecies and races. And yet, right, racism is built on this notion that there are racial differences. And so structural racism is the system in which the policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and other norms reinforce and perpetuate racial group inequality and allow whiteness and those privileges to disadvantage people of color. I'll skip through the rest of these unless somebody asks me a question. And so this same, right, structural racism is about invisible racism. And even though there are no official scientific racial distinctions between people, there is racism, right? Racism is real, even though race is not. and theoretically neutral policies and practices function invisibly in racist ways. And the best way to understand that is to look at the outcomes. And when you see disparate racial outcomes, you know that you have racism. Same thing with white privilege, right? And anti-Blackness, right? We don't always see it or recognize it, but it's there and it exists, you know, especially in business, right? And how we're treated and how we're not treated, how white business owners are treated versus Black business owners, et cetera. And so it also happens in co-ops. And whites are taught to think of their lives as neutral, normative, and average, right? Just like males are taught to think that, and yet that's not really what happens. And so white privilege is an invisible package of unearned assets. And so we've got to figure out as Black folks, right, how to get past that in order to do what we want to do. And then there's microaggressions, so even worse or even more invisible than white privilege are also these microaggressions, which are everyday verbal, nonverbal, environmental slights, snubs, or insults, whether intentional or unintentional. And that's, I think, the most important thing, right? Because so much, especially in the co-op world, there's lots of racial microaggressions, but they're technically unintentional. Sometimes the people who are doing them aren't even really realizing that they do them. And so that, you know, the harm is even worse. And then when you try to raise it, people get all offended because they're like, oh, no, I'm the most liberal person you know, or whatever. And so don't want to, right? That's going to happen with bank loan officers, even some credit unions who supposedly understand co-ops, right? Especially white credit unions, you know, are going to have these kind of attitudes too. So the attitudes are all around us, and they're going to also impact how well our co-ops can operate, right? And the negative messages that target persons based solely on their marginalized group membership. So racial microaggressions, the power lies in their invisibility to the perpetrator, and often their invisibility to the recipient even, right? Most white Americans experience themselves as good, moral, and decent human beings who believe in equality and democracy. They find it difficult to believe that they possess biased racial attitudes and may engage in behaviors that are discriminatory. So what do those look like, right? There can be micro insults, which are often unconscious, behavioral or verbal remarks or comments that convey rudeness, insensitivity, and demean a person's racial heritage or identity. Some of those are ascription of intelligence. If you assign a degree of intelligence to a person of color based on their race. Second-class citizenship, you treat people as lesser. Pathologizing cultural values and communication styles, the notion that the values and communication styles of people of color are abnormal or wrong or bad, the assumption of criminal status, right? So those are all the micro insults. There's micro assaults, which are more likely to be conscious. That's explicit racial derogations. Gosh, I never heard of that word before. Characterized primarily by a violent verbal or nonverbal attack meant to hurt the intended victim through name calling, avoidance behavior, right? Hate crimes would go into there too. Environmental microaggressions, right? At the macro level are racial assaults, insults, invalidations, which are manifest in a systemic and environmental level. And then there's the micro invalidation, which again is often unconscious, verbal comments and behaviors that exclude, negate, nullify, right? And those are like alien in your own land, believing that visible racial and ethnic minority citizens are all foreigners, this denial or pretense that white person does not see color, so the color blindness mythology, the myth of meritocracy, and the denial of individual racism. So that's what we mean by microaggressions. And as I said, they happen all around us all the time, consciously and unconsciously, even by people of color, right? We do it to each other, to ourselves, right? We internalize oppression sometimes. And then there's findings, I shouldn't have put all this stuff in, but there's findings that this influences our mental health, right? That even more than overt racism, right? These kind of microaggressions influence our anger, frustration, self-esteem, right? And that's also going to impact how well we can operate in our co-ops. And of course, the first step is to recognize them and to try to figure out, right, what the context is and how to address them. So that's what I mean by microaggressions. And that's why I said, you know, even if we're in Black controlled, Black owned co-ops, these are going to be issues both that happen to our co-op and can happen within our co-op because we have complex intersectional oppressions ourselves. So now, does anyone want to talk about it or ask more questions about it?
I think you might have unleashed. I don't think we're gonna get through all of it before before the session is done. But maybe I'd like to talk about some pieces that you've identified. So Jamie mentioned earlier about how do you change cultural behavior or norms or expectations that everybody sees that they bring value to the table, whether it's a dollar in cash or, as you mentioned, a dollar in values, goods, and services. And you might be the one that just watches out for a project or for a block or for a garden to make sure nobody messes with it while somebody else may be out there tilling the land. But I want to see if try to throw in I guess two things. One, if I could do Carter G. Woodson backdoorism. So those who may be comfortable or used to being second class, treated second class, expecting second class. In our neighborhood, we worked on a project that was kind of geared around trying to make the neighborhood more economically diverse, make the neighborhood more appealing. And some of the conversations that we had, so when we were talking about curb appeal, for example, for your property, my personal experience was I learned curb appeal and gardening and these things from my Black mother, my Black father, my Black grandparents. That's where it came from. But when we were having discussions in our neighborhood, oftentimes it would come up, well, you're trying to get me to be white. Mm-hmm. And so that whole thing, often rears its head. And then on the flip side of the equation, because we have been successful in making the neighborhood more attractive, a neighborhood that 40 years ago was 90% white, through urban renewal and root shock became 100% Black and low income. And now we're kind of trying to trend somewhere to still be predominantly Black, but more economically and racially diverse than what it was as a result of government action. I think Baltimore deals with this too. So as we see some white families or gay families or other families choose to come into the neighborhood, there's this conversation around, folks are coming to take the neighborhood, and which I personally often think is more of a, if I can go biblical for a second, more of we seeing ourselves as grasshoppers and seeing somebody else as giants than what actually is. So to me, what you just went through touches on a lot of that. I don't know if you could pick out one or two things and speak to it in your co-op. I see you've got the gentrification piece there. Speak to it in your co-op experience. How do we use the co-op to form common ground, even as we are working through our deeply rooted, seated cultural um, mental disease that white supremacy has played on all of us?
Right. Great question. I don't have all the answers. I was hoping we would be talking about it so we could maybe, all come to some answers together. But what I've seen, I can say a couple things. The first thing I've seen through history is that the co-op effort started with people who already had some affinity with each other. So a lot of the co-op started with people in the same congregation or people in a fraternal organization, or people actually who already lived in the same housing, either co-op housing or housing projects or something like that, or who were in a union together. So there is something to be said about starting with people who already kind of, or at least the beginning group of people who already have affiliation, affinity, even sort of know each other. That doesn't mean that that's the only way to start a co-op or that you have to stick with that group, but sometimes that's a way to start, to just get off the ground and to get some stability, right? And then to start bringing in other people. But when you bring in other people, you have to make sure to have just as strong an orientation and training so that they can, fit in and don't feel left out of the core group kind of thing, right? So core group stuff has its own problems, but it is sometimes a way to at least start and have a base and have, right? So that's one thing to do. The other thing I keep saying, and I can't say this enough, I've actually been learning about this more and more too, how important storytelling is, right? Give the examples, find and give examples. Sometimes even getting people, right? Sometimes you have to start really slow and small, get people to do the research. What else have we done together in this neighborhood in the last 50 years, right? And get people to do their own research, look up, talk to the elders, look up library, go to the library and look up newspaper articles, right? What have we done before that's like this? And people discover it together. And right, so doing that community research, sometimes that really helps a lot. Sometimes having the hard dialogues, right? I've seen it work where people who were trying to start a co-op or whatever actually invited people like the gang members and some of the naysayers to a meeting where they had a real heart-to-heart conversation. Why do we think this will work? Why do you think what you're doing will work? Why we think what we're doing will work? What does it mean? That kind of thing. So you could even do that with the newcomers. I do have a slide about newcomers in terms of gentrification. A lot of the gentrification problems, again, is lack of communication, right? We don't connect with the existing organizations, with other people's organizations. We don't make the important coalitions. And so then everybody feels like they're at odds or that one group is trying to take over from the other. And so having those honest conversations about who we are, who you are, what are we all here for, right? For white folks, right, coming into a community, being very consciously anti-racist about what they do, very conscious to make sure to say we're here because we want to be in a diverse place, right? Not that we're trying to take it over, right? Trying to figure out how to help white folks articulate that or talk to them to make sure that's where they're at, or help them to get to that place, right? So a lot of it is about communication and honest conversations, right? And then sharing the stories and then figuring out, right, what's our common goal, right? So again, having those conversations, this is what we're trying to do and why we think co-ops are going to do it. Have that conversation with other people in the community and see who's on board with that and who's not. I mean, it may be that you're going to have conflicts with people, but there's going to be a lot of unnecessary conflicts if you haven't had those transparent conversations. So it also might mean you need to bring in people who really know how to facilitate a contentious meeting, right? Who really know how to do conflict resolution, conflict transformation. So you might have to do some research or get some of yourselves trained and how to hold those kind of meetings. But often, sometimes just calling a visioning meeting, right? And getting everybody in the room to draw pictures of what they vision the neighborhood, and then talk back and forth about it, and then end with your group's vision and why you think your vision will work, right? Those kinds of things. But you can't get around that communication. None of the co-ops that I studied that I found out enough about that were successful, none of them skimped on having conversations with as many people as possible, even people that weren't going to be in the co-op. A lot of the co-ops, were more insular in terms of the actual members, right? But at some point, fairly early on, they also had community meetings. So community people and community leaders, even if they weren't members of the co-op, understood exactly what the co-op was trying to do, why it was there, and would be connected enough to support them when they needed to support them. And so I think, again, that's why I keep talking about this transparency and communication and telling stories and making sure everybody's, as clear as possible, or working through together, coming to clarity about what you're doing and why, what you're up against and why, right? And then being strategic about who and how to include people or not. I mean, the other thing that co-ops have to finesse is you also have to figure out when everybody can't belong. And I hate to say it that way, but that's another thing you've got to kind of figure out early on. My daughter actually helped to start a housing co-op on her campus, a student housing co-op. And it took them 2 years to figure out how to let somebody go, how to drop somebody from the co-op. And of course, their first purpose, right, was to find people who wanted to be in the co-op. But that turned out not to be hard because there were so many students who needed access to housing and affordable housing, and the co-op, of course, was giving affordable housing. So then they grew too fast and had too many people, and they had people who just wanted the affordable housing but didn't want to be in a co-op, but still joined because they wanted the affordable housing. So they wouldn't come to any meetings. They wouldn't help create the house rules. They wouldn't follow the house rules. And so then it became obvious they shouldn't be in the co-op. But then what do, right? You can't just kick people out, especially not in the middle of a semester. They won't have anywhere to live. So it took them 2 years to talk to each other, to write, to study it and what other people did. And they finally came up with a policy for how you stay or how you get renewed each year to stay in the housing co-op, right? And you had to attend a certain number of meetings, follow certain rules, participate in some committee, right? They ended up, right? And then it took them another year just to get it passed. First, they couldn't even get a quorum to pass the new policy. Then they had fights about the new policy. And finally, after all that time, they got the policy passed, and the co-op was so much stronger after that. So anyway, let me stop there. Hopefully that helps a little bit.
What jumped out to me, Rodney, when you spoke was about the whole idea about a certain community aesthetic being trying to be white. And so, the whole idea about CJ Park, and particularly the landscaping, is to create a certain aesthetic that will attract investment. And so what we did, we connected with a nonprofit that does design work, architectural design, landscape design, and we've had at least 2 community meetings. And the people, all the community members, participated in what they would like the park to look like, whether we'd have a gazebo, or whether we'd have a meditation garden, or this or that. But what I do know is that, everybody likes a clean, nice space. And I'm certain that it does something to, just our morale and spirituality when things are clean. You understand? And so, you know, to create something that can sustain that in a depressed community where, you know, every day there's trash blowing up and down the street, right? And so, you know, the challenge is, how do you sustain that? You know, you get a grant, you know, to do this lot cleanup, right? And everybody comes out on Saturday and it looks beautiful. And then you come back, you know, a month later, you know, and it's back where it was almost, right?
Right.
And so I think, you know, our object is first to create this company to make that an expense of the company.
Right.
Yeah, but I'll just add that. So I think what you described is in reality, everybody does not like a clean neighborhood, which is why every week you find yourself cleaning the same lot. And so part of what we've been doing, and I think we will continue to do, because our intent is to combine all these things in a particular block, create a model block with resident ownership and engagement, and then build out. But the what I was sharing is that cultural conversation, especially if you know, as I heard it. So, you know, I guess between or amongst Levette and me, I have lived in the neighborhood the longest, but I've lived here almost 30 years. Somebody who's lived in the neighborhood 50 years, they will quickly say, oh, you new people coming in, and they'll tell us that it's something wrong with us having mattresses on the front porch. So what we did was start with those community conversations, you know, cookouts, block parties, on a block at a time, just one block, not the whole neighborhood, but one block.
Right.
Where we could talk about, well, what is it that we want for our children? What is it that we want? Do we want to, and I think children is usually the where you can find that common ground. Do we want our children walking through trash every day or not?
Yeah.
And that allowed us to have some tough conversations around, well, maybe some of us do have cultural expectations that need to be shifted on all sides. But once we could come to an agreement on what that looked like, then we could work together and remind each other around that theme. And then because our neighborhood still is probably 60% rental, there is a lot of turnover in the neighborhood. So then being able to welcome and share with people who move into the neighborhood what the expectations are. And so, like, you know, this morning I was out here planting flowers like I do, and there's an apartment building right across the street. And whenever I would see the leasing agent trying to lease the unit, I would go over there and talk to them like, hey, it's a friendly neighborhood. We're family friendly. You see flowers out. There's James. He's going to watch over the neighborhood. There's Wink. There's whomever. But that constant effort, I would think from a co-op perspective, you know, I think at one of the last sessions, we talked about who do we staff.
Right.
You know, for us, in our efforts, we may end up staffing somebody who is that community engagement cultural person who is constantly welcoming and supporting folks as they move in or purchase or even walk through the block in the neighborhood, to try to make sure that we are being inviting and welcoming, and at the same time sharing, well, these are our expectations that we have here. Is this a place that you want to be a part of?
Right. And that makes a lot of sense. And that's part of what I mean by communicating well. And I like the fact that you're saying you realized you might have to staff somebody to do that. A lot of co-ops, some of the people naturally kind of play that role, but I think you're right to make sure it's staffed is probably important. But the other thing I wanted to say is I'm not sure I agree with you that some people don't want to live in a clean neighborhood. And I understand what you mean because they're not doing it.
I mean that based upon action.
No, I know, right, based on their actions. But that's where I was going to say part of the communication could be to figure out why it's not a priority for them, right? So instead of saying they don't want a clean neighborhood, it's not a priority for them. But maybe it's not a priority because they're already so stressed out, right? Between their two or three jobs, they're trying to raise their kids, right? They have other priorities. So worrying about whether their kid threw a wrapper on the ground or worrying about picking up a wrapper just might not fit, right? They're already so traumatized. So I think even just trying to talk to people about what would help them, right? Or what, right? I think, and and then I could also see some of the neighbors feeling like if the place is too cleaned up and looks too pretty, it'll get gentrified and they'll be pushed out, right? And so they're not going to pay attention to that either because they don't want to be pushed out, right? So trying to figure out how, again, it's still about the communications, but even going further to get to the root of why do they have this attitude, what's getting in their way of participating, what, how can you change that attitude, right? I think would help. The other thing I was going to say is I've found, and this is not just in my co-op life, but in my life in general, that the more we involve the young people, children and young people, the more the families come around. So even in the hiring, if you're hiring people to pick up the trash, you might want to create like a little youth collective that you hire to pick up the trash, right? And then the families will see their own kids are going to be starting to tell them, don't, we got to cover our trash can. We don't, we're not, because they're the ones that are cleaning it up, right? So they'll be yelling at their siblings and their parents to do something. So, and then when and then if it's something where their kids are making money, right? So again, trying to think of these collective cooperative solutions using young people, using kids, talking to neighbors, not just about what you want and what your values are, but what's happening in their lives and what would help them to participate. I think that's the other problem. We don't always ask, what would get you to participate? What can we do to help you participate? And that's going to happen in a co-op too. But I think for this particular issue, and then the last thing I was going to say, but you sounds like you sort of have done it already, like getting grants to already do the cleanup and stuff. I know of one group that helped neighborhoods to raise enough money to build a new playground. And I really love that model, even though it's not exactly a co-op model. But to me, it's like the beginnings of getting people then into a co-op and into some projects like what you all are doing. Because basically what they did was they would bring the community together. Okay, you want a new, or you want a revamped playground, and then dividing people into committees. We need people to raise the money, people to figure out because they're going to build the playground themselves, right? So who can purchase who can design the playgrounds, who can raise the money for it, who can actually help to build it, who has tools to share. And so when they get the community involved in that level, the community sees how they can cooperate together and what they can achieve, right? And then that structure you already have, the fundraising, the sharing, the builders, whatever, can stay for another project or even can be fed into some co-op models. So again, using what you are already doing and building on that in ways that, again, get people more involved, focus on people's strengths, what people can contribute, right? And as I said, I think getting their children as some of the gatekeepers helps a lot if you can, if you can make that work. And it also gives them some employment, because we know the young people all need employment and something to do. So those are some of the ideas I have for that. Anybody else want to jump in? I kind of lost my place, but I can get back to it. Does anybody else want on this topic, I guess, which is what our topic is, kind of engagement, connection, solidarity, relationship building. I think that's what we sort of have been talking about.
I'll just add one other piece, that part of the theorizing behind the resident shareholder ownership component is to say that that everybody can own a piece of the success. So as the neighborhood improves, or as the block improves, the value of your share in our enterprise also improves. So it's not just about if the neighborhood improves, you get pushed out. It is that if the neighborhood improves, you have a stake and potentially, depending upon if we did a housing co-op or something like that, you have a place in it.
Right.
And so that was part of that theory of trying to not have the dynamic that we know we often have that you described, that the better you make your neighborhood, then you help the prices go up, and the prices
Right.
go up, then you find yourself on the outside.
Right. That sounds great. I think that's important. Also, I think on this slide, which was like how co-ops can be a solution to gentrification, I also talked about, you know, connecting to the issues that are important in that neighborhood. So you may have to also be involved in the effort to keep, you know, affordable housing in your neighborhood, right? So there may be some policy advocacy and some other kinds of stuff. People may need to see the co-op involved in those kinds of things, so they believe you when you say, oh yeah, we're trying to keep you here, we're not trying to push you out, right? So that they see how you're engaging. One of the organizations I engaged with in DC was able to get some community benefits agreements with developers to help keep affordable housing and stop some displacement. It wasn't totally effective, but at least it helped. But again, it also showed people what side we were on and what our real purpose was, right? We wanted to revitalize, but not gentrify, right? And I often use that language, right? Because people think the only way to revitalize a community is to gentrify it, but that's not true. We can revitalize without gentrifying, right? We don't have to displace people. We don't have to move people in order to revitalize neighborhoods. And that's exactly what you guys are trying to do, making sure, right, the co-op makes that case and is clear about that. And then, as I said, gets involved in other things to show that that's what your commitment is, that's what your level of commitment is, I think can also be important. Let me see what else I had. Oh, okay. So how about a break? Can we use a 10-minute break? Is 10 minutes good? All right, so what time is it? We'll be back at 11:48. 11:45. How about 11:45? Okay.
Ron, can you pause the recording?
Okay, we're back. I just realized I have not been looking at the chat. Thanks for the reminder about the break. So we took the break, and then Rodney, I'll answer that later. I don't know if somebody, Anna or someone, could you keep track of the chat if there's something you want me to comment on in the chat? Can you let me know? How about that?
Yep, definitely.
Okay, thanks so much. Okay, so let's move into, I think I had a couple more slides on what we're up against, and then more about solutions. So just quickly, or maybe we're in solutions already now. Diversity, inclusion, equity, and justice. So I actually prefer to use the term DIEJ because I think diversity and inclusion are the lowest level of things, right? Diversity is just, you know, inviting someone to attend or to the dance or whatever, if you want to use a dance metaphor. Inclusion is where people actually dance or asked to dance or talk to at the dance, or some kind of recognition and participation. Equity is, that's where what we're really trying to get more: equality of the participation, equality of decision making, equality of the outcome, right? That you participate in the planning, you contribute to the decisions about things, to the policies. There's some equality of the experience and the equality of the benefits, right? which is what we mean by equity, right? So it's not enough to be equal or to have equal access. It's more we want equality of the outcome, of the experience, of the benefits. Everybody should benefit equitably. Oh God, I can't say my words today. Sorry. And then to me, the ultimate goal is really justice, right? Again, it's not diverse. I don't want diversity for diversity's sake. I want diversity for the sake of justice, right? And what do I mean by justice? The power balance, the mutual respect, ownership and control, the financial balance, right? And we know that to achieve justice, it's actually a continuous process, right? We're never just there. We're always maintaining, addressing and whatever. So all the things we've been talking about already, to me, are trying to get us to this equity and justice in terms of participation, who's involved, who's there, who benefits, that kind of thing. I don't know if you guys need this, but that was just, I usually use this with my students, right? The reality is all that level of inequality. In fact, the poor little black boy is actually in a ditch, not even at the fence, right? Equality is just giving everybody the same box to stand on, but that doesn't really address the issues. Equity is trying to address the issues, even if it's with different solutions for each person, but to make sure the outcome, right? They all can look over the fence. And then I put the liberation one in just because thinking out of the box. I know that for baseball, in some ways, you actually do need a fence, right? It's much easier to keep the ball in to play the game. So I'm not necessarily saying we always need to get rid of the fence, but the notion that there might be something even more than just equality of outcome, we might want some level of liberation, whatever that means for the situation. So I've got that. Then, you know, we can't achieve racial or political justice without economic democracy and economic justice. But of course, economic democracy and co-ops need racial equity, right? So we're not going to achieve either one without the other. So again, more about we've got to figure out, right, how to address all the injustices. And hopefully we can use co-ops to address most of them if we're proactive and deliberate and paying attention to all these pieces. So it is a continuous process. We have to address the power inequities, even, right, within Black communities, right, their power inequities. That's part of why I was trying to, ask people what's stopping them from participating, right? Because sometimes there's all kinds of issues that we either haven't thought of or that we haven't taken into account, and we make our own assumptions about why people aren't participating. And so we really need to ask people, and we need to figure out how to share the power more and what sharing the power means. In terms of racism, that means being actively anti-racism, not just anti-racist, because I'm more worried about racism, not whether you're racist or not, being actively anti-oppressive. But also we could talk about that for class oppression too. We want to be active anti-classism and anti-hierarchy if we really want to make change. The other problems in co-ops are these income and wealth assumptions. We already talked about them. You guys preempted that, right? With what do we do with people who don't have the same level of income or wealth or the availability to participate financially, right? So I think we talked about that already. We know that co-ops in some places have been colonizing agents, right? We know that ag co-ops in the Midwest helped the United States to take land away from indigenous First Nations peoples, right? And that people used co-ops for bad things. So again, trying to understand the history and people's history with co-ops and their relationship to co-ops so that we can, talk about, changing the paradigm even within the co-op movement, making sure the co-ops are much more liberatory. There's siloing effects and sector isolation in co-ops. Seems like you guys don't have that problem as much. You're trying to do a variety of different kinds of co-op networks and using the co-ops to do very broad things, but often, the rural co-ops feel more superior to the urban, or there's much less resources for urban co-ops. Sometimes the more formal co-ops are not very respectful of the more informal ASUSUs and mutual aid and that kind of thing, and don't see them as real co-ops, right? The worker co-ops have been very isolated from the ag co-ops and the rural electric co-ops, things like that. So the siloing can be a problem, but again, I don't see that in your examples. It seems like you guys are much more looking at ecosystems, right? And the ways that the co-op either can combine a bunch of different issues or can have different sectors within it, that kind of thing. Some co-ops that are more internally focused with their education and just try to help their own co-op rather than connecting with the community and with society, that can also be a problem as well. And then we sort of went over the gentrification. I've seen examples where especially white food co-ops come into an area because the land is cheap, but they're almost a gentrifying force, right? They make it easier for the white members to feel comfortable in a neighborhood, and they kind of help change a neighborhood. But there's also ways that we can see co-ops as anti-gentrifiers, right? And that was that slide I put up. Oh, and then I had this little thing about I was trying to lighten things up, right? Give them the right of way through our land. And the next thing you know, they'll want to put up condos, fast food places, parking lots, right? And I think, Rodney, you already talked about some of the neighbors feeling that way about just cleaning up the empty lots, right? It'll just make way for other people to come in and take things away from us. So again, co-ops can be part of that solution. First, increase the meaning of concern for community and cooperation among cooperatives, really get out there and show that you're part of revitalizing, not taking away that community, connecting better with the neighborhoods, with neighbors, inviting relevant long-term residents of color to things, connecting with existing organizations, engaging the, oh, okay, sorry, I went over this already. Sorry about that. And making sure you really are authentically developing out of the community and the neighborhood efforts. You're not kind of trying to transplant or impose things. This was a quick reminder of what, why co-ops are good and, what are the benefits of co-ops. I don't know. I think you had other sessions that talked more about this, I think. But, they're democratic and equally owned. They provide money and jobs in communities. They're economically, environmentally sustainable. They're not charities, right? They're actual businesses, and they're an empowering self-help solidarity mechanism. The burdens are equally shared in hard times, and the profits and benefits are equally shared in good times. They're actually more resilient during downturns. And in crises. They often start out of a crisis, but also are more resilient and flexible during crises. They're part of an international movement. They do make people's lives more equitable and just. And again, back to the flexibility. So not just resilient, but flexible. There's no one right way to do a co-op. It's about flexibly addressing community needs and using all the values and principles of solidarity and cooperation in order to do that, so values-based businesses. And they are viable. We have lots of great examples of co-ops that have made it. For me, also the other benefit of co-ops is they're part of what more of us are calling the solidarity economy. Right? These are alternative grassroots economic frameworks against neoliberal globalism and capitalism, right? Grounded in these notions of solidarity, cooperation, anti-oppression, non-hierarchy, promoting social and economic democracy and equity and sustainability, pluralistic and organic. So pluralistic meaning there's lots of different forms, as long as they, reflect those values and principles, and organic meaning, again, grassroots, bottom up, and they support caring and support, right? So they're an economic way to really focus on caring and supportive communities. We think of solidarity economies in the 21st century as being transformative because they do have the potential to redistribute power and resources to those who have been most harmed by white supremacy, settler colonialism, patriarchy, ableism, and capitalism. They meet an immediate material need for a community. They're not symbolic, but actually deliver the housing, food, education, culture, and other human needs. And they challenge the power systems. And these are some of the other principles: shared resources, shared vision, liberation, culture, caring, relationships and accountability, democracy and process, education and leadership development. I think this is redundant. So I said cooperatives are values-based, they're right, designed to solve community needs. Their goals are to save costs, provide quality goods and services, increase income, combat discrimination and marginality. They allow people to pool resources to practice democracy, real democratic governance, to achieve double and triple bottom lines. And they also anchor local economies, which is what you all are trying to do. Worker co-ops in particular, we haven't talked that much about them, but often lead their industries in providing living wages, often provide health, vacation, retirement benefits, but also, right, they give workers control of a company and access to the shared profits. And I think I said this already, they have lower failure rates, better longevity than traditional small businesses, right? We have some data that after the first year, only 10% of co-ops fail versus 60 to 80% of small businesses. After 5 years in business, 90% of co-ops are still operating versus only 3 to 5% of traditional businesses. So a lot of people lose sight of that because, again, in capitalism, they keep telling us co-ops can't work and they're too hard. You can't run a business democratically, that kind of thing. But actually, especially compared to small businesses, co-ops are actually much more stable a structure. And because, right, they include community, they include multiple voices, they include profit sharing and democratic participation, that's partly why they do last longer. And then especially for low income, low resourced and underserved communities, right? And to workers who need to control their own labor, co-ops can really be supportive. They help to provide community control over economic resources, activities, and assets. You guys pretty much know all that. And so before I get into my examples, right, the means, of course, is economic democracy, the way that decisions and activity are people-centered, not profit-centered. The grassroots framework of co-ops based on solidarity and cooperation that helps reduce hierarchy and reduce the dominance in our normal economic relations. Because multiple voices are heard, we have multiple stakeholders that participate together. And again, that's why this communication, right, is so important. And then often, especially for worker co-ops, the workers and the invisible laborers, like women, get to have a larger voice in what they make, what it costs, how they work together, what they get paid, what happens to the surplus. And so again, that participation by people who normally don't have the power to decide and participate, gain the power in this. And so then what's our goal, right? Our goal is really what I call an economics of abundance, right, and prosperity. We want economic exchanges and distributions that are fair and equitable. We want the most number of people to benefit. We want to eliminate exploitation and inequality. We want to eliminate poverty, eliminate private monopoly and dominance that seeks profit at the expense of human beings and human dignity. And the economy, I would say, too, we need to worry about climate change and ecological sustainability. We want to build economies based on human values and needs of society to eliminate need, enable prosperity for all, and community well-being. And even some of us talk about human perfectibility, right? And when you look at economics as abundance, right, not a zero-sum game, not about managing scarcity, but about the fact that when we do this together, we can create abundance and nobody has to lose, right? That's kind of the goal of why we engage in this. And so, of course, African Americans have engaged in this, right? We've searched for alternative economic solutions to address discrimination and inequality. We've used African retentions, self-help ideology, voluntary segregation. It gives us a chance to design and manage needed services and goods in culturally, racially, and geographically sensitive ways. And we do have this long history. Do you all want to, I guess we're a small enough group, we don't need a whiteboard either. Want to just go over what you guys see as benefits of co-ops, why you guys have been interested in starting co-ops, and then, as I said, I'll get into some of my examples through Black history. Or do you want to use the whiteboard? I think I can pull it up. It seems like all the, the whiteboard and small groups are more when there's a larger group and we don't get enough people talking. But I have to say, not all of you have been talking. You all need to say something. We're not here for 3 hours so that all of you can just sit and listen.
I think the one thing stands out for me as far as the benefit, or the first thing that jumped out to me was that statistic that you had mentioned a little earlier, just about the success rate of co-ops as compared to traditional small businesses.
Yep. I'm trying to find it again. I don't know. Oh, there it is. Yeah, we don't know that. In fact, when I first started studying co-ops as an economist, right, that's what everyone said. Oh, they're a failed model. They don't really work. Can't run a good business having, democratic decision making. But when you look at the numbers, this is worldwide. These numbers are worldwide. Yeah, it's really it's not a failed model at all. It's a very viable model. And we know that what, over a billion, I think it's over a billion of the 8 billion people in the world are part of some kind of co-op. Things like that. We know co-ops are used a lot more than we think also. So it's not sort of some white elephant kind of model. Sorry, I didn't mean to keep talking. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to jump in.
No, that's good. I was just want to ask is it more labor intensive? When I say labor intensive, I mean emotionally, kind of like.
Yeah, I would say definitely. And some people believe that's partly why co-ops last longer, right? Because people they have to put more energy and more effort into it, into starting it, into maintaining it, but they're also not doing it alone, right? So much of small businesses are just sole proprietors, people who are trying to make it on their own, or so many small businesses and corporations are just trying to make a profit, right? That's the other thing I think that makes co-ops longer living and more flexible. They don't have a profit bottom line. They obviously have to make a surplus, right? There has to be some profit so they can keep in business for the next year, right? But they save a lot of money on not overpaying their managers, by not overpaying or paying for middlemen when people can do multiple jobs, right? And then the joint decision making actually, again, if you learn how to do that well, can just make a business stronger because you have multiple buy-in and multiple ideas that get thrown around so that you solve the problems faster, you can solve the problems more flexibly, that kind of thing. So I think it's a combination, but yes, I think we should never tell people that it's going to be easier to be in a co-op, right? Because there's a lot of people who are also just used to being passive, right? That's one of the other problems we have in co-ops, is how to train people not to be passive anymore, right? How to train people to start to participate, and how to make sure that when you're training people to participate, you also have a good procedure for how to participate. So that's kind of the balancing act. But if you can get that balance, then you can do well.
Thank you.
I'll go ahead and jump in. I myself, in my previous life, I was a part of a, for lack of better words, a failed business, small business. And so, yeah, I can attest to the fact that, small businesses, I can see where small businesses tend to flop compared to what I think is what an incredible model in co-ops. I just wanted to add that, you know.
Yeah. Appreciate it. That helps. You know, the personal experiences help a lot here. And the lessons learned. The other thing, you know, even you say when your business flopped, there's always lessons learned, right? You probably have more skills now than you ever did. I also talk about that with co-ops, even the co-ops that do fail, and it doesn't mean that there aren't any failures, right? There certainly are. But I've always found all the failures that I studied, the people still came out of it better off than when they went into it, right? They knew more, they had more experience, they had developed social as well as economic skills. They were able to move on and do something even better, that kind of thing. And so I think we also have to think of it that way, right? The whole process of being involved in these kinds of activities, being entrepreneurs, being social entrepreneurs, working with other people, right? It's always a learning process. So even when the co-op doesn't make it in that form, there's so much else that got developed, and so much, and there's more things that happen after that because of that experience, that it's really important never to think of it as a total failure, even though obviously I use the words failure here. And I wasn't trying to critique you as using the word, I was trying to use a teaching moment.
No, I understand.
Reminding myself that I like to talk about how much we learn even when we do have failures or challenges.
Right.
There's a lot of co-ops that have challenges, but learn more enough so that they're stronger later.
Yes.
Yeah,
And
I think the co-op offers a 360-degree learning experience.
Right.
Yeah, and whether you invest a little or a lot, you're going to learn a whole lot.
Yep.
Just by interactions with others. I just feel that with that learning experience is the reason why they're probably more successful than most businesses.
Yeah.
Because they offer a 360-degree learning platform.
I love it. Yeah, I'm going to start using that. Okay, no other comments about that? Can't remember why I asked this question. How can co-ops not practice solidarity? But I guess we also already have been talking about that, when the challenge, right? The challenge is when it's hard to practice it, but again, the solution is more communication and stuff like that. So I guess we talked about a little bit about all these.
Yeah, but if the leadership of a co-op is not actively engaged and they allow individuals
right
to take control of the co-op, then it can work to their disadvantage and not be a solidarity sort of enterprise, because it's focused on a few individuals as opposed to the collective of the individuals.
Yeah. And actually, I have a pet peeve, which is an example of that. There's some consumer and farm co-ops that don't practice solidarity with their workers, right? So some consumer co-ops, like food co-ops and things, right? Their purpose is to keep the prices affordable and accessible to their members, right? But they forget about their workers. So I'm also becoming more and more a fan of what they call multi-stakeholder cooperatives, where consumers and workers, community workers, and suppliers can all be in the co-op together. Because again, that gives us a stronger sense of solidarity. And I know once, actually my food co-op in DC voted off. They had one worker rep on the board, and one year they had an initiative to vote it off for some really paternalistic reason. They kept saying it was unfair to the worker to have to stay extra hours to be on the board, and the board was really about the consumers and trying to keep the prices down, but the workers would want to argue for their wages. And if their wages went up, then the prices couldn't stay down. Anyway, it was horrible. I was really horrified that my co-op voted the worker off rather than addressing the problems of how do you have multiple voices and how do we treat our workers right in the co-op, right?
Mm.
I saw some farm co-ops that way too. The farm co-ops that were co-ops of the farm owners, the landowners, right? And they're also, right, the processing, right? They're owning a co-op to do marketing and processing of their goods and that kind of thing, but they don't want to pay the farm workers, right? But then what kind of solidarity system is that, right?
Mm.
They need, their co-op needs to work by still honoring, right, and paying the workers properly. So that's another area where we could forget, right? But then I've seen other co-ops where they actually either are multi-stakeholder or they allow what they call worker self-managed collectives. And so the workers have a role to do some level of self-management and decision-making about their actual jobs, even if they don't have a position exactly on the board. And then they can also join as members separately of the co-op. So there's ways to get around it, but again, we have to recognize it as a possible issue, especially again, if we want to be liberatory, right? It can't just be a solution for those of us who are owning the co-op. We've got to have solutions for all the pieces, right? The ecosystem. No other comments? Okay. Oh, go
Well,
ahead.
I do want to just say you just invoked a new term that I don't recall you using, liberatory.
Oh.
Can you elaborate on your definition of that word, liberatory?
Yeah. So for me, right, I actually became an economist because I wanted to figure out how to make economics and economic systems liberatory, meaning help to free us to be all we can be. I did have somewhere human perfectibility. Where did I have that? Here, right? So that's what I mean by liberatory, right? How can we create systems and structures that are going to make us all prosperous, that will help us to perfect ourselves as human beings so that we can go on to create, human dignity and liberate us from all those oppressions and exploitation that we've been living with, right? And so for me, the co-op is a structure, not necessarily the only structure to do that, but the cooperative economics is a structure to help us get to that liberation, right? First, we start with the people who we come together in the co-op and we help to liberate our co-op members. But to me, if we're just doing that, we're not solving all the community, all the universal, all the human problems. We have to also use our co-ops to help get our society to the next level. And so that's again why we need some level of solidarity, even between the classes or the groups of people in an enterprise, between all the people that it takes to create an enterprise. So again, if we're doing food sovereignty and we have a food co-op, but we're exploiting our workers and we're allowing the farmers who we buy produce from to exploit their workers, and we haven't really liberated the system. We've only gone part way. But if we go full way to recognize, right, that we also have to figure out how not to exploit workers and still do the things we need, get the prices we need, all that kind of stuff, then we're moving toward a system that's really going to liberate all of us from exploitation, from exploiting the ecology, right? We also need to be liberatory in terms of how we deal with Mother Earth, right? Because our years are numbered if we don't figure out ecological sustainability and how to address climate change, right? And co-ops could also do that if we if we included that in our notion. And that's why I think that's why I liked your ecosystem in the title, because it's really about creating an ecosystem of liberated spaces, of of liberated economic spaces and solidarity economics, right? It's going to take us looking at all the different components, pieces, and starting small, but with this larger view that we need a whole ecosystem of economic liberation. How's that for an explanation?
Wonderful.
Okay, so examples from Black history of cooperative development and what I'm calling voluntary segregation, because you'll see a lot of the Black co-ops voluntarily agreed to just stay in Black control, right, to keep self-determination among Black folks, not to try to integrate into white co-ops, not even to try to create white integrated Black and white co-ops, though some of them did. But this voluntary segregation is a term I got from actually W.E.B. Du Bois, who talked about that sometimes we need to be deliberate about voluntarily segregating so that we can create our own self-determination, our own economic stability, right, and take care of our own and operate from a place of strength and power rather than integrate from a place of inferiority and lack of power. So he has a statement about using cooperatives so that we can enter the new city as men, not mules, right? So we need to assert our own humanity first, take care of our own, have self-determination, create our own wealth, and then if we want to integrate or however we want to become part of the larger society, we can do it from a place of strength and power and not a place of not as an exploited people that's kind of begging to come in. So what were some of the examples? So when I did the research, it turns out we do have a long and strong history of mutual aid and cooperative ownership, especially with economic racial discrimination and market failure. It was often a hidden history, complicated by marginalization and thwarted by discrimination and white supremacist violence, but yet we still have this continuous history of resistance, perseverance, and cooperation. There's my book, right, which is a story of survival, resistance, and prosperity through co-ops. I also helped to work on a 2020 study of current Latinx co-ops in the US. It's not a history. Someone still needs to do that history. But Esther West, when she was at the Wisconsin Center for Co-ops, did put together an understanding of what was happening, what kinds of co-ops, how many were predominantly Latinx co-ops, what were their benefits, what were their challenges, that kind of thing for people who are interested in that. Here's a list of some of the African American organizations I found that either were co-op developers or used mutual aid or cooperation in their mission, values, and purpose. So the Colored Farmers National Alliance and Cooperative Union from the 1880s, the Ex-Slave Pension Society, our first reparations organization, was actually a mutual aid association as well as a lobby organization, lobbying for ex-slave pensions or back pay, right? I didn't answer the UNIA question. I just realized it. We got into something else. Universal Negro Improvement Association, I do talk about in my book. They didn't actually incorporate any official co-ops, but their joint stock ownership and their vision of democratically run joint stock ownership companies between US Blacks, Caribbean Blacks, and African Blacks, has to be mentioned when you're talking about economic cooperation. And Garvey's vision that we wouldn't have real power until we had economic power, right, fits into this whole mode. There is a UNIA group in Atlanta called Us Lifting Us that are doing co-op development in Atlanta and around the world. So they also see their mission as following Garvey as including co-ops. And then the other thing I wanted to say about Garvey's vision, I ended up with a lot of information about W.E.B. Du Bois because he turned out to be very supportive of cooperative economics. And I know Du Bois was always supposed to be so critical and was very critical of Garvey, but I did find an interesting letter in Du Bois's letter after Garvey was deported and the assets of the major businesses were confiscated by the US government. Du Bois did write to, and I'm trying to remember who it was. I think it was the Office of Economic Opportunity or the Office of Economic Trade. Anyway, to the to whatever the group is that confiscated the assets of the Black Star Line and the Negro factories. He wrote and said that they should really return the money to each individual. You know, everybody put in $5 to own stock. That they should be returning the money back to the Black people, because so they could use it again to try a new joint project. Because if the government just kept the money and kept talking about how Garvey's economic stuff fell through and was a failure, then Black people would again be reluctant to pool their resources and engage in joint stock ownership, and that we couldn't afford to miss this opportunity to just reinvest rather than to be discouraged about this this notion that we could own businesses together and improve ourselves, etc. There is no evidence that he got any response to that, but I do think it's another important thing to think about, another lost moment, because he was right. They just, the properties were confiscated. No one was able to really to learn the lessons or benefit from all that pooled money and reinvest it somewhere. So sorry, I forgot to answer that earlier. Negro Cooperative Guild was very short-lived group started by Du Bois to get Black folks together to talk about cooperative education and then start co-ops in their communities. But like 4 or 5 co-ops did get started after that one meeting they had. Colored Merchants Association was a co-op of individual Black grocery store owners as a way to combat the growing white chain grocery stores and supermarkets. So it was a purchasing and marketing cooperative of Black grocers. 1920s and 30s was the National Association of Colored Farmers, which was a combination of farm owners, Black landowners and Black farm workers, which is also the Colored Farmers National Alliance. So in both of those cases, they were doing cooperatives and collective activity and joining Black farm owners with Black farm workers, so that trying to get all farm workers to be able to own their own land and farm together, that kind of thing. Young Negroes Cooperative League, I think I have a slide about them. Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, I think I have a short slide on them. And the Women's Auxiliary, Ladies Auxiliary, which was doing co-op education for years. The Poor People's Corporation out of Jackson, Mississippi in the 1960s. SNCC members started those co-ops. The Black Panther Party was doing community development and co-op development, even in a reaction to state violence, right? The Federation of Southern Cooperatives Land Assistance Fund, which exists today, but was started in the late 60s. The Nation of Islam also, starting in the 80s, started to do worker co-ops and food co-ops. And currently we have groups like Green Worker Cooperatives in the South Bronx that are doing green industry worker cooperatives in green industries. Cooperation Jackson, which is trying to do a municipal co-op federation. As I said, Us Lifting Us in Atlanta. The Movement for Black Lives also has a co-op platform, and I'm sure you guys could add more organizations. But again, so you can see, that's why I talk about this sort of continuous history, at least over the last 150 years. But, you know, in my book, I go back even further.
I have a question.
Yep.
The Brothers of Sleeping, I forget the name of it.
Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters.
Is that A. Philip Randolph's
Yes.
foundation?
They're the first official, right, 20th century official Black independent union, right? They're Ladies Auxiliary, so that's the wives and the maids. So the maids were actually in the union, and the wives of the union members ran this Ladies Auxiliary. And the Ladies Auxiliary, one of the main things they did was co-op education. They started study groups. They had they started a couple of credit unions, a couple of buying clubs, grocery stores. They were part of an I co-op in labor-owned I co-op in Chicago. And so, yeah, that's another thing that most people don't know about the Brotherhood, was how strong the Ladies Auxiliary was in doing co-op and consumer education. And
Jessica,
A. Philip Randolph actually in 1918 wrote an article in The Messenger, his socialist newspaper, about the benefits of co-ops to Black people. So from 1918, A. Philip Randolph was actually promoting co-ops. Yes, Ron?
yeah, I'm thinking of the film The Great Debaters and
Yeah.
depiction of Melvin B. Tolson and his organizing of farmers at that point in time. Was that the part of the 1930 movement in terms of the farmers?
I think that might have been part of the National Association of Colored Farmers, but I never was sure. I actually love that movie. I was never sure if they kind of fictionalized in general or if they really meant the National Association of Colored Farmers, but I think it probably was that group. Because remember, they were tainted as being communists, and
Yes.
there were all kinds of they had lots of trouble staying in business, but they had actually lots of early successes of helping give Black farmers access to fair credit, buying land, and also they got fair prices for the produce that the farmers were producing, so that farmers earned a lot more money than they would have if they hadn't been in the association.
Okay.
So,
now,
yeah.
Now, in your 60s and 70s, you noted the Poor People's Corporation. Are you equating this to the Poor People's Development Foundation? Or this is a separate?
No, I met, you and I keep talking about that and I keep forgetting to add it. No, this was definitely a SNCC group out of Jackson, Mississippi.
Okay.
That started a bunch of co-ops just in the Jackson and Mississippi area, but you're absolutely right. I keep forgetting. Yeah, I'm going to make myself a note. Because yeah, remember that was one of the things I was trying to get more information from you about so I could start adding more about that effort, because I kind of missed it. Yeah.
Well, the National Cooperative Bank have made some revisions to their website.
Oh, good. Okay.
Well, they mentioned the movement, but they don't mention the group.
Oh, that's too bad.
And yes, it's too bad that they don't see the real leverage of mentioning the group
right.
and its efforts in terms of its founding of the National Consumer Cooperative Bank at the time, which later changed its name to National Cooperative Bank. But yeah, and I'm still there, still advocating that they that they
fix it, right. And I still want us to do that article for my group, Grassroots Economic Organizing newsletter. We still need to write a little piece for that. I just have been so busy, but yeah, we need to get back to that. And I actually am writing a preface to my book they're gonna reissue it. And so I'm gonna have that in the preface. So I will get back to you again.
Oh, great. Thank you.
I'll make sure to mention that I had left it out of the book the first time and it should be added. But I definitely need to add it to my my PowerPoints. There was something else I was going to say because you asked me that, and now, sorry, I forgot.
I do want to say too that Asada Richards, who you do know, one of the things that she brought back to our group was this thought about voluntary segregation and how important it is for us to develop our own pathway for elevating the work around Black cooperatives. And so I just wanted to just let you know that she has taken your tutelage in terms of what the boys have said, and she's brought it back to us and sort of reaffirmed to us the reasoning why we need to focus on developing a organization that's devoted purely and solely to building out the ecosystems for Black-led and Black-governed cooperatives.
Good. I'm so glad she's doing that. And yes, it's very important. And remember, also, that's why I spent some time on us understanding microaggressions and structural racism and stuff, because that's another reason why we have to have some level of voluntary segregation to do this, right?
Yeah.
to create that, to create the strength so that we can participate in other ways. But because of, you know, the racist system we're in, it's very hard to do that if we don't look inward first and develop our strengths first. So a range of informal solidarity practices that we all do: barter, pooling resources, beneficence, mutual aid, revolving loan funds, and rotating savings and credit, right? And then there's formal co-ops, credit unions, food co-ops, electric co-ops, farm co-ops, producer co-ops, purchasing co-ops, healthcare co-ops, home care, child care, craft co-ops, etc. So the Young Negroes Cooperative League, one of my favorite of the early organizations, right? We've got George Schuyler, who was a columnist with the Pittsburgh Courier, but lived in Harlem, wrote a column calling on young Negroes to save the race with economic cooperation. He chastised the old folks and said they still were trying to do everything through capitalism, and didn't realize that economic cooperation and co-ops would serve the community and serve the race better. He and Ella Jo Baker then co-found the Young Negroes Cooperative League in December 1930, and in 1931 they hold their first conference in Pittsburgh. Right, 600 people come, 600 Black folks in 1931. The height of the Great Depression. They actually make their way to Pittsburgh to talk about young Black people starting a co-op movement. Ella Jo Baker gives a talk on the role of Black women in co-ops and gets elected as the national director of the organization. And she and Schuyler run the organization from Harlem. Their goal was to form a coalition of local cooperatives and buying clubs that are loosely affiliated in networks that then affiliate into councils, to regional councils. They wanted to start with 5,000 charter members that each paid $1, so they would have a $5,000 pot. They only made it to 400 members, so they didn't reach all their goals, but a lot of Black co-ops got created at the time, and Baker, for 4 years, went all around the country teaching people about cooperative economics and how to start a buying club and then turn that into a co-op, grocery store, that kind of thing. So a really interesting organization. And they had this long-term plan. Oh, well, first, right, they had councils in New York, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Columbus, Montgomery, Pennsylvania, which I don't even know where that is, Monessen, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Phoenix, New Orleans, Columbia, South Carolina, Portsmouth, Virginia, Washington, D.C. They held the second national conference in D.C. in 1932, and had this strong education program. And then they had this vision. Oh, sorry, I don't have the vision there, but the vision, right, was of interlocking systems and ecosystems, right, starting with the co-op education that the National was doing, and then getting people to form these councils in each place. And those councils starting co-ops, credit unions, and forming with other councils in their state to create state and regional organizations, to have regional worker co-op factories and regional warehouses to feed all the co-ops, that kind of thing. So there, some of the other earlier groups kind of operated in ecosystems, but they're, to me, the first ones that really articulated an ecosystem, and again said it was sort of the job of young Black folks to move this vision along. Also during the Great Depression in Gary, Indiana, right, Consumers Cooperative Trading Company, they started out with a study group because the last bank had left their neighborhood, and they didn't know what to do. So actually some teachers and the principal of a Black high school in the neighborhood called a meeting, and a bunch of people came and they started studying cooperatives, and started with a study group. They studied for about 18 months before they opened their grocery store. Or actually they studied, then they started a buying club, then they turned that into a co-op grocery store. Within a year after it opened, the grocery store was considered the largest Black grocery business in the country, right? This is in 1936, right? So a co-op did that. They then opened a credit union, a second branch of the grocery store, and a gas station. And again, they had an ecosystem approach that, right, they needed to address all the different issues in their neighborhood and lack of access in their neighborhood through co-op and co-op ownership. The grocery store actually paid back dividends, so there's some wealth creation there, right? Paid back 2% on shares of stock that were owned in 1936. So they also very quickly were able to pay back what's called patronage dividends. So they were part of not just the solution to lack of access, but also the solution to increasing assets and wealth in their community. And then my final example from the 1930s, I think it's my final example, was Cooperative Industries of DC, chartered in 1936 as what was called then a self-help cooperative in Lincoln Heights, DC. The FDR administration actually had a division of self-help cooperatives in their Office of Economic Opportunity because they realized how important co-ops were, right? The FDR also started those co-op cities. I think there were 6 green cities around the country. Greenbelt now is the only one left, but they were not just green spaces, but cities that had like 4 or 5 cooperative businesses, co-op housing, co-op grocery stores, co-op newspaper, co-op childcare, etc., to show, again, to model these self-help cooperative initiatives. Cooperative Industries of DC was actually a producer cooperative, a worker cooperative of unemployed, unskilled workers and homemakers. And they started doing sewing together, canning, broom making, etc. They worked outside of Nanny Helen, in the basement of Nanny Helen Burroughs' School for Women and Girls that she was famous for. They eventually got a federal grant for employment opportunities for unemployed women and used that to continue with their worker co-ops, but also they bought a farm and became a hybrid worker and consumer co-op, bringing food in from the farm to DC to Black folks for food security stuff, as well as continuing to create good jobs. Nanny Helen Burroughs, one of her purposes for this industry was she wanted to make sure women could make better living instead of being domestic workers and exploited workers, that they could actually work in their own factories and their own businesses. Oh, and the Ladies Auxiliary to the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters promoted co-ops, as I said. Their vision was to keep good union wages recirculating in Black communities. So they also had a Buy Black campaign, but they also wanted not just to buy Black, but they wanted, co-ops that were controlled by Blacks and kept the money recirculating. They started multiple study circles in most of the chapters of the Brotherhood throughout the 30s and 40s. They trained in consumer economics as well as cooperative economics, started some buying clubs and a credit union here and there, but mostly they were doing co-op education. And then the Black Panther Party, as I said, right, even though best known for, anti-police brutality, they saw state violence, right, poverty, homelessness, etc., as and police brutality as part of state violence, and that really without these survival programs and community organizing programs, they couldn't, just self-defense wasn't going to be enough. They also believed in political revolution, and they realized that if we didn't start to model the kinds of programs and practice the kinds of ways we wanted to live in communities together, that on the way, while we were waiting to achieve revolution, we should be practicing and living the values that we wanted in the new system we were trying to create. And so they organized co-ops and collectives. They had clothing factories, bakeries, plumbing repair, pest control, transportation for the aged, transportation to prison to visit prisoners, and free healthcare, right? The free health clinics, collective newspaper, and they practiced communal housing. They distributed free products from their own co-ops, as well as products that they got donated to them, and of course the free breakfast program with history lessons. So a huge, right, community organizing, community economic development strategy that most people, again, don't recognize. They, the police and the media have always focused on them being gun totaling, by any means necessary, self-defense, but not seeing the real self-defense programs were about cooperative community development. And then to bring us up to the current, right, even during COVID, we have co-ops, worker co-ops starting. Kai Fresh Kitchen in Chicago started in 2020. They're a woman and minority-owned business. Most of their members are previously incarcerated. They create meals, freshly cooked, healthy food rooted in the culture and traditions of the people that they serve and deliver, right? So they create and deliver food, which of course was important during COVID, but they had been starting their business like 3 or 4 years earlier. They had started researching this business, and then they were going to wait till COVID ended to start, but then they realized COVID was actually a perfect time to start because, right, there was more food delivery needed anyway. They're mostly institutional food deliveries, not individual. They don't have individual clients, but still, it's important. And they chose the worker co-op model because they wanted to make sure every worker shared in the governance as well as the profits of the business. So again, they were doing good both within how they were structured as a business and also in the world outside. And the last newest co-op I know of is the driver-owned ride-hailing co-op in New York City called the Drivers Co-op. Important if we think about, right, where co-ops really fit almost any niche. So here's cooperative ownership of the platform, the ride app, right, the ride share app, right? They started in 2021. Their purpose was they wanted better pay for drivers, right? But they also wanted to help the taxi business to transition to green, right, to green industry, and they wanted better access to riders, better solidarity with riders. So the co-op model allowed them to control the app, control the business, give the drivers much more higher wages, whatever. Profits go back to the drivers. Decision-making is democratic for the drivers. And then the riders, right, could participate more in a solidarity economy, connect with the drivers better and share in the lower costs, that kind of thing. They're able so far to make 8 to 10% more. The drivers make more than they would have driving for Uber and Lyft. And I believe their goal, if they haven't achieved it yet, is also to make the rides cheaper for the riders than Uber and Lyft. So those give you some examples. Let me stop again, because next I wanted to get into barriers. And let me look at the time and see if anyone has anything to add. I think I'm running out of time, right?
Yep, about 15 minutes.
Okay, so maybe I won't go into barriers. Maybe we'll just go into summing up. But anybody have any comments or questions about my examples? I'll just kind of speed through barriers so no one says I didn't mention them. I think you have other sessions that talk more about barriers, right? We know capitalization, access to capital is a barrier. Adequate and proper orientation and training is a barrier, but we're doing much better. Like this program is filling that need. Distrust and excessive competition. We talked about that already, that people don't understand the model, or, we need to build trust, better communications. We talked about the ideology of capitalism and settler colonialism getting in the way. We talked a little bit about class politics and policies and hierarchy and racism and patriarchy. So we actually talked a little bit about some of these barriers already. I didn't talk about the history of sabotage, but we know that so many of the Black collective economic actions were thwarted. Sometimes it was just simple financial sabotage. No bank would give a loan or would give a line of credit. Subprime lending, sometimes insurance company would up the premiums once they realized what the Black co-op was doing. Sometimes there were other kind of financial things that got in the way. But then there were actual examples of physical white supremacist threats and violence, like lynching and arson and things like that. And most of those were very debilitating, obviously, but the other lesson learned from that was how important community support. Some of those co-ops, community members actually took up arms to protect the co-ops and to protect the co-op members, that kind of thing. And so even with all that sabotage, efforts persisted. And as you saw, we still have this long continuous history. Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah. In the history of sabotage and bringing it up front into today's space, you know, I'm really concerned about the financial sabotage that goes on, the lack of access to capital, not only to support the co-op businesses, but the access to capital in terms of organizing and mobilizing cooperatives, foundations, and what they and the role they play in subtle and sometimes overt a sabotage of not supporting the work of building Black cooperative ecosystems. And you know, I speak about the National Co-op Bank, and I think that's sabotage when they mistell or don't tell the full story of Black participation in the historical foundation of an institution, of a national institution. I think that's sabotage because it sabotages us in a way of giving onus to the fact that we were in a participatory mode and we were engaged in a way much higher than probably others had envisioned or knew of. So yeah, so I just wanted to
yeah, no, I think it's really important, and probably it could be another whole nother session. I think, again, for me, the sort of lesson about all that is, right, we have to eternal vigilance, right? And we do, that's where we need coalitions, right? And we need policy advocacy, right? Because we've got to recognize where the policies get in the way, where we can have some coalitions with people who are willing to put the right policies in place, and you know, and that kind of thing. So that's sort of my quick short answer, but I think you're right. We probably need a lot more brainstorming about how to get around some of that stuff and what the different options are. The only other thing I would say about the financing is I am excited about the non-extractive financing that groups like Seed Commons are doing, where they're doing, right, it's a co-op of local community co-op loan funds that are doing non-extractive lending. So you get a loan, but if you can't pay it back or the co-op isn't successful or whatever, you don't owe it back. And if you are successful, you don't really pay interest, you pay back the loan so it can be reloaned out to another group. And the whole purpose of it becomes a grant or whatever if paying it back is going to undermine the co-op, that kind of thing. And so there's a growing movement of those kinds of loan funds. And so I think, to me, that's also back to trying to figure out internal ways. You know, what's good about Seed Commons is they have a national funder who actually attracts a lot of white gilt money, and then they distribute it down to the small loan funds. And so the small loan funds don't have to raise all the money themselves. So that's, again, a quick way to talk about some of those things. But I think you're right. It's going to take a lot more strategy, brainstorming, etc. Okay, what else do I have here? Oh, just some examples, but I'm going to skip those because we've got to wrap up. And I did want to do a little bit of plus deltas, what worked for today, what didn't work, what's left, what else we need to talk about. But here's the 1880s sabotage. Here's the Apex Taxi Co-op, which was sabotaged because of the insurance premium went up because they were the only cabs going into white neighborhoods in Milwaukee. New communities in Georgia, right? They were sabotaged in multiple ways, shooting at their offices, diluting their water and fertilizer, and not being able to get loans. They actually won the case against the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And even though they lost the first property, which was the first modern community land trust we had, they were able to get new property, 20 years later after they finally won the case against the U.S. Department of Ed. So that's, it is a reparations example, and it is a success story of some level, even though they lost their first farm. I was going to break us up into small groups again, and then again, solutions, right? So we need to create these solidarity ecosystems, better learning and training, better outreach and communications. We need to address the invisible systemic racism and racist practices. We need better materials, right? More up-to-date materials, which, as I said, we're getting slowly. We're doing better with more people's histories. We need to rethink and rewrite development strategies to address issues and conditions of the marginalized and invisible. We need more adequate resources, management and training and financing. The human energy, enthusiasm, right? We need to figure out how to keep that up, keep that going. We need to pay attention to developing solidarity and trust. I can't say enough about how much we need all kinds of formal and informal education. Bring in young people, recognize the leadership of women. All those have turned out to be important through history in terms of the strengthening and the strength of the co-ops. And then, here's the non-extractive finance. I already talked about that. And I think I'm just about done, right? For me, what I noticed in co-ops is they're most effective when they address needs and solve community problems through a sense of solidarity, economics, and collective ownership. Combining of movements, right? Populism, labor, civil rights, cooperative economics. You could even add gender rights, right? When the co-ops are part of these combined movements, they're also stronger, and they help to address multiple oppressions. When they're promoted by strong Black organizations, you've got the Network for Developing Conscious Communities is a great example, right, of all that you're doing to help promote co-ops. We've got lots of examples of strong Black organizations. Part of a supportive ecosystem, right? We've talked a little bit about how to develop, right, ecosystems on neighborhood and city and regional level, but also ecosystems of support from national and international levels on down, and the importance of, right, gaining political as well as economic power, so that sometimes we need these policy changes too in order to be supportive. And this is just, what do we mean by an ecosystem? Systemic understanding of what helps. This is an ecosystem for worker co-ops, right? Includes all the different players and all the different elements. And here's what I think of as co-op ecosystems, right? It's all the pieces, especially the supply chains, especially the education and finance interlocking co-ops of support. And an example was the North Carolina system that started with 2 Black educational institutions. They started a regional network and then a statewide network. And the statewide network was actually able to do a huge statewide education program for Blacks about co-ops. And in 10 or 12 years, they went from 3 Black credit unions to 98 and 48 other co-op enterprises, so that their whole ecosystem approach and education approach worked. And so here, back to my economics of liberation, if we changed our focus to maximizing human potential, from maximizing profit to maximizing human potential, right? And maximizing human energy, right? Which is the energy we expend to reproduce and sustain ourselves. If we produced innovation so that we could keep perfecting that, we could create the prosperity and the leisure that we all want. And to me, we have to put energy into education and practice of human liberation through solidarity and cooperative economics. I was going to have you guys have some action plans, but we're not going to do that. And we can achieve transformation if we follow these principles and values and keep our energy up, right? And so then I was just going to ask for feedback. What worked, what didn't work. I don't know if we have time for that. Mm-hmm. 3 minutes.
Yeah.
No feedback? I don't know if that's good or bad. I actually
Well,
prefer feedback, so I guess it's bad.
sure. I'll provide some. Just looking at a lot of those co-ops, historical that like the North Carolina co-op, and I'm in Georgia, and I'm a part of a co-op that's 56 years old. We were one of the co-ops that created the Federation
Oh,
of
yeah.
Southern Cooperatives. Yeah, my co-op is West Georgia Farmers Cooperative, still going
Oh,
strong.
right. Okay, wonderful.
Yes, ma'am. There was I know Mr. Page when he was alive and running the Federation. Between I guess 1980 to maybe I don't know 2000, there was a lot of co-ops in Georgia, like daycare co-ops and kind of like in North Carolina. But I noticed a lot of those co-ops die out due to lack of regeneration. Not able to
Right.
have succession planning to for consecutive generations. What that's something I feel like that's an Achilles heel of the Black co-ops movement. We'll get them started. They'll be dynamic in that first generation, and then they'll die out. So maybe we can have some discussion and some conversation, or you can give us maybe some examples of how co-ops can be intentional about being multi-generational and
Right.
having succession plans.
That's a great question, a great thing to end on too. That's part of what I meant by education and training, orientation and training, right? A lot of co-ops do really well with the first generation of owners, right? Because they spend a lot of time on the startup and meeting together and all that. And then they kind of forget, they get focused on keeping the business running or whatever and forget about how to keep bringing in new people. But again, some of the strongest, especially the strongest worker co-ops that I've come across, really pay attention. They see it as continuous education. So it's not just the new people who have to get oriented and educated into the group, but that the group keeps learning together. So that it's not just on the new people to kind of catch up, right? So that notion that we're a learning community, that we have to learn, that we do need succession planning. I also think we could learn a lot from the student run co-ops, because most of the student co-ops, right, the students are there for 3 or 4 years and they graduate, right? Well, those co-ops that last, half of their purpose is to train the next group, right? So Food from the Hood in South Central LA and Crenshaw in the 90s, right? Every year they were training the 9th and 10th graders on how to run their business, how to be members of their business, because every year their 12th graders were graduating. And not only that, the co-op was helping their 12th graders to graduate, right? They were helping them to stay in school, to see why it was important to know math and writing. And they had voted that half of their profits would go to college scholarships. So not only were they helping their members to graduate from high school, they had money to give them when they graduated so they could go on to college. So they had to keep replenishing themselves. So I actually think we should be learning from how those student co-ops do it. How do they keep, right? How do they keep continuously replenishing themselves, re-educating and right, and how do they do that? And I think it's about these orientation programs and this seeing themselves as continuous learning organizations. And I think we need to get more of our co-ops to see that. And also a new notion of leadership, right? It's not about the founding members or the catalytic leaders, right? All members of co-ops are leaders in some way, and we need to also have a better notion of shared leadership and fluid leadership, right? You lead in this thing, but then you step back for something else and somebody else leads, right? So we need to better articulate all that. I think all those things would help us.
Thank you.
I tried to answer all the chat. I think I answered it. Luckily, most of you talked and didn't put it in the chat. And it's been a pleasure. I'm sorry I tried to pack too much into this. I thought I was leaving enough time, but I guess there's too much to talk about. So there's always more to talk about.
Always more to talk about.
Will we get the PowerPoint?
Sure.
Oh,
I can
yes,
share it.
yeah. Yes,
Or
you'll get it.
actually, I think Anna has it already. I don't know, Anna, if you could convert it to a PDF
Yeah, I can.
before you share it. Yeah, that would be great. Thanks.
Yeah, and they'll get this recording as well. Jessica, I just want to thank you for allowing your time and your spirit to this work. I send my blessings to you as you continue your work, and I know that that what you share with us will enlighten us to go further, because I see this as generational work.
Yeah.
And so we're building a generational platform, rebuilding on what has transpired in the past, so we can build for the future.
Absolutely. And I'm very excited about all the projects you guys told me that you're involved in. I think they all sound wonderful, and
Oh.
I wish you all good luck.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, this ain't the last time that we'll connect.
Right. And I hope I'll see all of you in other spaces.
Yeah, hopefully in Las Vegas.
There we go, in June, right?
Yes, right. That's right. That's right. All right. Well, folks, we've come to the end of I think session number 9. I think. Yeah, they're going fast. They're going fast. 3 more to go. So yeah. So Anna will make sure that you get the recording as well as the PowerPoint presentation. I look forward to all 3, to everyone being on board next week. Hopefully everyone will get their dues together, so so we can have our cameras on. Be nice to see everyone. Again, just a closing remarks. Andy, do you want to say anything as we close out? Your mic is off, Anna.
Yep. Thanks everyone for a great session. It was really a great session today. I think there's reminders on the end of my emails. So if you guys want to refer to them, they're the same as they've been like in the past weeks. But that's really no specific for today.
All right. Well, everyone, continue to have a great Saturday. Thank you for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you next weekend.
Thanks so much.
Bye, everybody.
Wow.
Bye-bye. Anna, can you stay on for a second?
Yep.
All right. Well.
Finish the recording.